He served in the United States Navy as the rank of Yeoman Second Class, and he served in the Korean War. So let's begin our interview now with Nate. Good morning, Nate. I'm happy to interview you, and we want to tell your story the way you want to tell it. So we could start anywhere. You want to start with your early days, where you grew up, and how you got into the service. Let's start there.
Okay. Well, it was in 1948 when they were talking about doing the draft and drafting men in the Army, etc., etc. And I didn't want to go into the Army for one reason or another. I had a cousin of mine who was in the Navy for a couple of years because he was a little older than I. So I saw him and I approached him and I said, I'm thinking of going into the Navy. And I said, what is a good job in the Navy? He said, you want to be a yeoman. I said, what does a yeoman do? And he said, well, they do administrative work. You don't have to worry about chipping paint, and doing these other things that may not be of interest to you. So I said to him, okay. So I enlisted August the 3rd, 1948, and I was going to Great Lakes, Illinois. But it was kind of interesting. I enlisted on White Street in New York City, and we had the date fixed, and my folks gave me a party, a going away party, and when I went to go down to the enlistment place and so forth, I just had my toothbrush and a toilet article kit, and they said, I'm sorry, but we can't take you today. You have to go, you'll come back tomorrow. And I said, what? I said goodbye to all my friends and my family. So I left, and actually what I did was, I lived in Manhattan, so I took in a movie at the Paramount Theater, I believe at the time. And I spent most of the time there, and I went home early evening. And I said, I was a day late. I mean, a day early, I should say. They said they wanted me the following day. And they said, all right. So the following day I go, I report for duty, and I get on a train. It seemed like a cattle car. We were going to go to Great Lakes, Illinois. It had slatted seats, and we took the northern route. I'll never forget it. It took approximately 36 hours to get there. And it was extremely uncomfortable, but whatever you do, you do. So we finally get up there, Great Lakes, Illinois, and you go through the lines, getting your uniforms and getting your stuff, and they throw the stuff at you, your uniforms, your fatigues, and all that stuff. And then you go to the barracks and you get your bunks and your stuff, and then you start in your training. Well, what the Navy trains you for, several things. They train you in firefighting school. They train you, if you can't swim that well, you better swim, because if you can't go into the Navy unless you have to swim around the pool. Fortunately, I was able to do that, so I didn't need too much training there. But the most important thing, I think you learn discipline, and that's a very interesting thing. In the respect, some young men going in, everybody has led a different type of a life, and here they want you to focus on what you should be doing. And they're pretty tough on you at the very beginning. The chiefs are, just like the drill sergeants in the Marine Corps, but not quite as bad as that. But at any rate, so there you go through various training. You shoot, I think with the M1 rifle, you learn how to shoot a gun, or rifles, and in the evening there's various things that you could do. I can remember one fellow, they had some boxing matches, and he was in our group, and we cheered him on, and I don't know whether he won or lost or whatever, but whatever it was, it was. Now the training took 10 weeks, approximately 10 weeks. And I said, I was talking to the people who assign you your jobs, and they give you tests. The test is to see if you're qualified to do what you're thinking of doing. And I took the test, and I wanted to be a yeoman. I told them I wanted to be a yeoman if I could make it, pass the test or whatever. And they said, okay, fine, you take the test. And what happened was I did pass the test. So I went to yeoman school in Norfolk, Virginia. And there were only 3 things in Norfolk, Virginia. In 1950, you have to remember, Norfolk was one of the largest naval bases in the United States. But it's 1950, that's 60 years ago. And the only thing they had there, there are a lot of bars there, and they have a lot of tattoo parlors, and they had a lot of prostitutes there. And the thing that I noticed on the lawns had signs, dogs and sailors not allowed. And I felt kind of funny because I came from the north, from New York City. I said, don't they know I came from the north, And I said, I never saw anything like this before. So that was a little bit of an education. The next education I got was I met up with a fellow by the name of Bill Cayley. He came from Mount Kisco. We went to yeoman school together. We had something in common. What it was exactly, I don't know. He said, one day, he said, let's get some tattoos. I said, I don't know about that. He said, come on. Well, my brother was in the Marine Corps in the Second World War, and he had 4 tattoos, but it was done with jungle juice, and one of the islands he was at, and it faded about 6, 7, 8 years after they put them on. You could hardly see what was on them. But we noticed this big advertising sheet on this tattoo parlor. It said, Charles Coleman, world-renowned tattoo artist. And this was from the New York Times. So I said, well, he can't be too bad. So we went in, and I proceeded to get a tattoo on my right forearm. And in it, I had a heart put in with an arrow, and I was intelligent enough not to put any women's name in there. I put my mom's name in there, so I said, well, I'll play it safe, And I got a tattoo. It cost me $3 at that time. And then Cayley had one put on. I forget what that was, and so forth. And then he said, maybe we'll come back another time and get another one. And I said, well, I don't know about that. Well, to make history short, we went into town again another time, and I got another one on my upper arm, on my left side, on my bicep, whatever, and it had an eagle with the American flag and U.S. Navy. And that one cost me $5. It's kind of interesting because I see the kids today, they spend $300, $400, $500, and I said, you should have gotten this one back in 1948, it only cost $3, But at any rate, and then he said, well, we should go back again. I said, no, I've had it. He said, no, you have to balance the arms. And I said, what do you mean balance the arms? He said, you have to get one on your forearm, your upper arm, on each. I said, I've had it. And that's the way it went. So after going to yeoman school, I was assigned to the 4th Naval District, which is in Philadelphia, and I worked for a captain. I was a general inspector yeoman. And it was good duty. I believe he had a son in Annapolis, like I was his adopted son, but whatever. And it was kind of unusual, the duties that I had. Unusual in respect that normally you work from 0800 to 1600, 8 to 4, and at 1400, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he'd come into my office. He'd say, all your reports done? I said, yes, sir. He said, take off. So I was off at 2 o'clock every afternoon. I lived in New York City at the time, and I did not have any duty on weekends. I said, oh boy. I said, so, but I liked Philadelphia. I used to go into town because I liked jazz, and they had some good jazz music down there. There's a place called Palumbo's. And I found out that that place was there a long, long time. In fact, I always liked the theater. And in Philadelphia, I saw the Will Maston Trio at the time, and there was a young black kid, and he was tap dancing and everything else, and that was Sammy Davis Jr. So that was kind of interesting. And naturally, all through the years, I knew who he was. But at any rate, 2 years go by. Now, I enlisted for 3 years. So I said to him, you know, Captain Nisselman, I like working for you. You're a great person, you know, and it's an easy job. I said, but I haven't had any sea duty. And he said, oh, no, we need you here. I said, I only have 1 year to go. He said, no, we need you here. Well, the reason why he said that is because he probably didn't know the next yeoman he was going to get. So, kind of interesting, 3 weeks later, after he said he needed me there, I get these orders. It said, Priority A, come West Sea Frontier. Well, that comes from Bupers, that's out of Washington, D.C. And I said, what is this? He said, well, you got sea duty. I said, what? I said, 3 weeks ago you said you needed me, and now I got sea duty. I said, how come? He said, well, you got 24 hours to get on the plane to go to San Francisco, and then for further transfer to San Diego. There's a destroyer waiting for you. I said, waiting for me? He said, yeah. He said, they need a yeoman aboard there. I said, how did this all come about? He said, there's something going on in Korea. And my next question was, where is Korea? And he told me where it was and so forth. And I said, okay. Now, that's where I learned at that time that Korea was a forgotten war, because there was no media, no TV media that covered Korea that I know of. And when I went home, I didn't tell my parents I was going to Korea, because they didn't even know anything about Korea. Korea was written up in the New York Times, maybe 6 or 7 sentences, all through the war on a 154th page. And even when I went overseas and came back, there was still no media. Nobody knew what was going on. So I just told my parents I got sea duty as I had requested, because I didn't want them to worry. So before I know it, I go to San Francisco. It's kind of interesting. It was July the 11th, it's the 12th now, and it was 94 degrees in the summertime in Philadelphia. And we didn't have the jets in those days. It took about 12 hours getting there. And we landed at 0300, 3 o'clock in the morning. We got off the plane. We were wearing our whites at the time, summer whites. We got off the plane. It was 30 degrees. I said, don't they know it's summer here? I said, how come it's so cold? Oh, I found out something about San Francisco. What happens in San Francisco is, because of the Oakland Bay Bridge, it starts off low temperatures in the evening, and then it climbs to about 70 degrees during the day at noontime, and then slowly but surely it goes down again. Okay, so we spent about 4 or 5 days there. It's a very interesting place, San Francisco, and I enjoyed it. It was cosmopolitan or whatever, and then I had to get to San Diego. I went down to San Diego, and the executive officer meets me. He said, you're Yeoman Barsky? I said, yes, sir. He said, boy, do we need you? I said, yes, sir. And he said, you write the log, don't you? I said, yes, sir. And he said, we're 3 weeks behind in our log. I said, oh, thank you very much, sir. That meant I had to play catch-up for 3 weeks, 21 days or whatever. But whatever it was, it was. They had scribbled it out, and I had to type it up and send it to Bupers. And that's the way it started. Well, during the time I got there, we were doing various exercises, ASW, anti-submarine warfare. We used a zigzag pattern in case there were any torpedoes or whatever is coming at us. And then we were shooting at sleeves, aircraft sleeves. We had 40 millimeter guns in those days, and we're using them to shoot at the sleeves and so forth and so on. And approximately 4 months later, 5 months later, we started to head overseas. And I believe it was either Midway Island first or Pearl second, or vice versa. But at any rate, we had to refuel, so we refueled, and in Midway Island, it was the island, what we call the island of the Goonie birds. And there were about 90 personnel there, and these birds used to peck. They'd walk and they'd peck with their necks. And it's kind of interesting because when you looked at the Navy, the personnel there that were stationed there for a year or two, they started pecking with their heads too. They followed suit. But that's the way it goes. And before I knew it, we were in, I think from there we went to Pearl Harbor. And it's kind of interesting in Pearl Harbor because we spent about 3 or 4 days there. And I was a kid from the city, and I said, boy, I can't wait to get off, get a pizza, slice of pizza or something like that. And we got off the ship, and there was one main restaurant there. It was called the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. No, I forget the restaurant. After leaving Pearl Harbor, I want to make a correction. We went to Pearl Harbor first, and then we went to Midway Island, the island of the Goonie birds. But at any rate, from there we refueled, and then we headed towards North Korea. And we went up, we got Task Force 77. We met up with a bunch of ships, and we were going, and what we call steaming. We were going maybe at the rate of about, flank speed would have been 37 knots, 34 knots, whatever. But it was really something when you have about 25, 30 ships along with you, and you're going up there, and before you know it, you're shooting at targets of opportunity with the other ships, and these big guns are going off. We had 5-inch 38 guns that were going off, and we were receiving some counter battery fire, and we continued this, and then we pulled out and we just started going to different areas. But the most important thing was we spent 52 days or 51 days at sea before going into port in Japan. And having spent, my office was amidships, and I'd look out and I'd see the shoreline, which was maybe 20 miles away, and I said, we're never going to get into port, Yeah, one of those things. But at any rate, what we finally do, we head into, I believe it was Sasebo. You got Sasebo and Yokosuka, which are the 2 naval ports in Japan, and we got there, and I was in charge of the Liberty cards. And all my buddies said, oh, you're going to go over on Liberty? I said, no, because you guys are going to, I know it's going to happen. You've been at sea for 51 days. I said, you're going to go crazy in there, and so forth and so on. I'll go over the next day after things quiet down. And I was absolutely right, because when they went over and they came back 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, they weren't feeling any pain, and they were wearing all the stuff they bought from the Japanese people and so forth and so on. So it was a little wild, but that's the way it was. But I was impressed with the Japanese people at that time. And the reason for being impressed was, if any of the sailors or Marines or whatever, if they were inebriated because of drinking and they dropped their wallet, they would chase you 100 miles in order to give it to you back. Because I figured it out, you don't have to be a genius, that they did a turnabout. Maybe it was because of what they did on Pearl Harbor and so forth. But they were very, very honest people, and it was very interesting. So after spending some time there, then we'd go aboard ship, and we'd meet up again with other ships. One area that we met up with went on for about 2 or 3 years, was called Wonsan Harbor. It was a naval blockade. And it was very difficult because some of these big ships that went in, like the New Jersey, and even my buddy who I met recently, he was aboard the Wisconsin. And sometimes the counter battery fire became so strong that these ships had to drop anchor and get the heck out of there. And that's the way it went for a while and so forth. And then there was an area where in Hungnam, where we evacuated some of the fellas, some of the men and women who were there, and because again it became too hot, and that was part of our job in the service, being in the Navy, to do what you can. Another thing that we did when we had aircraft duty, we'd follow some of the aircraft carriers, and if any of the pilots didn't hit the main deck right and they'd go into the drink, that we had to go after them. Unfortunately, everybody that we went after, we recovered them and they worked out all right. The only unfortunate thing was, because of the cold water and everything else, they needed some minor help and so forth. But we picked up everybody that we went after over a period of 2 years.
Talk about Christmas. 1950. Explain some of the things that went on at Christmas time.
Okay, Christmas time, that's kind of interesting. We were at sea, and Santa Claus came over in a helicopter, as I remember that. And that was kind of interesting. And a lot of the fellas, you know, they weren't used to being at sea at Christmas time. Everybody used to spend time at home, you know, but this is a different place. But you did what you had to do, and that's what it amounts to. And
you also saw floating mines. Explain what these mines were, where they came from, and what you did with them.
What the North Koreans did, this was a little bit of an archaic war in a respect. It wasn't sophisticated. They would put a mine on a sampan, and they'd come out late at night, and they'd put the mine right near the bow of a destroyer or any other ship. And when the ship took off in the morning, and the sentry didn't see that mine, it would blow up the bow. Now, there are several destroyers. One that I remembered called the Walkie, W-A-L-K-E. It was a destroyer. And they lost, unfortunately, about 29 men because they were at the bow and it wasn't a good place to be.
These sampans are, what are they, like fishing boats or?
Yeah.
Small boats.
Small, very small, you know. And
but you also, it mentions you also were a picket ship. What does that mean?
A radar picket ship. Well, a radar is you're looking for various things almost like sonar, but sonar is below and radar is on top. You may be looking for aircraft, you may be looking for other ships in the area. And there were times when we were in the northern part of Korea where we didn't know exactly who owned that territory on the beach. And we would just take our time. There were times when you couldn't even see your hand in front of you because it was foggy or whatever the weather conditions were. And fortunately, most of the time, and we couldn't communicate by code because we didn't, by radio, because we didn't want to let the North Koreans know where we were. But finally, after we felt safe, more or less, and we knew where we were, then we communicated with the other ships, and we proceeded to do whatever we wanted to do, and that was it. But that could be a very scary moment, you know, when you're going and everything is nice and silent and so forth, and you don't know what's going to happen. But at any rate.
Now, did you have any incidents with men overboard? You familiar with any got people falling overboard?
No, fortunately, there's nobody. There were a couple of close calls because we took on fuel at sea, and we also took on provisions at sea. Now, unfortunately, once in a great while, the guys who are handling the lines and so forth, if you get a bite, if one of the lines wrap around your ankles and that line is going out, that can take you over the side, and then we'd have to see if we can get you out. But it came close for a couple of sailors, but fortunately nothing happened. But we used to take a lot of fellas who got hurt over there, casualties. We'd pick them up and take them to a larger ship, and we transfer them by high line. And that was a very interesting procedure, you know, because here you are, you have to be on the same course. Two ships have to be on the same course, and meanwhile that person is being transferred in a...
How do they get the line over to the ship? Toss it over?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. You'd get fairly close to the other ship, you know. You'd be maybe 20, 30 feet away, and they had a gun that they shot off, and that went over there. Talking about that, very interesting incident occurred when we were at sea, and we were moored alongside another ship. It was a communication ship. I believe it was called the Union. Now, a much larger ship than ours. Their main deck was about 30 to 35 feet higher than ours. And I happened to recognize one of the men there during the afternoon. He was near the lifelines over there, and I called him, and I recognized him from somewhere while we were in the service. And I said, you know, what kind of a movie do you have tonight? And he told me the name. And I said, hey, your movie is better than ours. And I said, can I come aboard? Oh, yeah, you can come on aboard this afternoon, take a look. So in the afternoon, when I went on board, they had a gangway there because their deck was way up there, and the only way you can get in is through the gangway from my ship to their ship. Okay. So I go in, I watch the movie, and I didn't figure anything like this was going to happen, but when I came out of the movie, it was pitch black. Now, there was no smoking on the ships. All the lights were out. I looked at my ship, which was maybe about 15, 20 feet away, and with the line going across. And actually, it wasn't that far apart, thinking about it. It was more like 6 feet away. I can look down and I can see in the pilot house where the instruments were on. That's all you could see, the instruments, because you couldn't see the instruments unless you were above, like the ship that I was on. You couldn't see them from shore or anything like that. So here I am. It's pitch black, and sometimes when you're young, and that's why they take young people in the service, you have more guts than brains. I said, gee whiz, I said, my ship is going to take off tomorrow morning, and I'm going to be on this ship unless I do something different. And then I thought for a moment. I said, how do I get over there? Well, I looked at the lines, and I said, okay. I get onto the line that's going onto my ship, and hand over hand, it's about two and a half inches thick, the line. Hand over hand, I'm going down slowly. I'm saying to myself, I hope that boatswain may tie a good knot up there, because I knew that if I fell down in between these two ships, nobody would ever find me. Nobody would ever know what happens. And I'm hearing the splashing of the water going in between both ships, hitting both ships, you know. And I finally make it. It was about 35 feet that I had to go down. And then I jumped aboard and I got onto the main deck of my ship, and there was a sentry there. And he said, who goes there? He heard a big thud, you know, and it's nice and quiet until I jumped onto the deck. And I said, Yeoman Barsky. And he said, where did you come from? I said, from up there. Well, he said, you crazy so-and-so. He said, how did that happen? And I told him, and that was that. But these are the things that occur during the war or whatever.
Tell us what bird dog duty is.
Bird dog duty?
Yes, you were relieved from bird dog duty. What does that mean?
That's a good question.
Well, let me ask another one. Go on.
Okay.
Apparently, you were being fired upon from shore. What do you call that? Counter battery?
Well, it's battery fire, and then we counter battery.
So someone from shore was firing.
Oh yeah.
At you.
Yeah.
And you fire back at them.
Correct.
Were there any shells that came close to hitting your ship? Or
3 out of 4 ships got hit in our division. 3 out of 4. There were 4 ships in the destroyer division. I know the names.
They got hit by shore fire.
Correct. And fortunately, there were minor casualties. There were no fatalities, fortunately. And we were the only ones, you know, I used to see the shells plopping around, splashing here, splashing there.
From your guns?
No. From their guns.
Their guns.
Correct. Now, my job, there's 2 jobs in the service. One is your military job, and one is your regular job. Well, my regular job was, I was a yeoman. I did administrative work. I took care of records, I took care of the log, and anything that had to be typed. There were 4 yeomen in the office, and I was one of them. But my military job was, I was in CIC. That's Combat Information Center. And that's where you had sonar, and you had radar, and you had everything going there. And then you had the you had the training situation and the pointing situation. I was in charge of the 5-inch 38 guns. They were the big guns that went off. Our shells were close to 4 feet high with about 6 or 7 inches in diameter. And they used to go as far out, I think, as 22 miles. But they were big. And on a small ship, when these guns went off, they would vibrate the ship so much that below decks, the bulbs used to break where our bunk beds were. And they used to break, that's all. And believe it or not, they didn't have the type of hearing prevention around your ears. They had some, but it didn't work, because many years later I needed hearing aids. Fortunately, I got some through the Veterans Administration, and I had to have my ENT doctor and had to fill out forms and so forth. And because where I was shooting the guns from was maybe 8 or 9 feet away, and they made a big bang, and that was that. So, but I met up with a very interesting guy who influenced me on leaving New York City. If you can think about this, he was a farm boy from Iowa. His name was Don Kurth. He was a farmer. His father was a farmer. And his grandfather. They were all farmers. And I was from New York City, from the opposite side of the world, according to him, and he was in another place for me. First thing he asks me, he said, "How many acres of land do you own?" I looked at him. I said, "I live on the second floor of a 5-story tenement house in New York City." And he said, "Well, that seems kind of tight to me." I said, "Yes, it certainly is tight." And jokingly, I didn't even know what an acre of land was. I said, "How many acres of land do you own?" "Oh, we have a small farm." I said, "Okay." He said, "We have 750 acres. I'll never forget that. I said, 750 acres? I said, "That seems like a big place for me." And he said, "Well, it's pretty good, whatever." So we became buddies.
What was his name again?
Don Kurth, Kurth. Don and I, what happens, it's almost like you're going to college, but it's not like college. You meet up with these guys, and somehow there's some sort of an attraction there. It may not be anything that you have in common. Could be just something different. And there were about 3 or 4 of us that we used to pal around together and go drinking together or whatever. But Don was the only fellow that I thought was more interesting than the other fellows who lived in Pennsylvania or other areas. And he always talked about houses and trees and grass, and I didn't know initially what he was talking about because nobody owned their own house in New York City at the time, and there wasn't any land. I have a golf story to tell because 10 years ago I took up golf. We had 3 days off, and we went to this Camp Woods in Japan. It was an army camp, and it was a hot day. It was about 90, 95 degrees, and we looked out there. We rented a car, and I said, "That looks like a golf course." I said, "I've never played golf." I said, "Did you ever play golf?" He said, "No." I said, "Let's go up there and see what it's all about." So we drove. Nobody was playing golf that day. It was all nice and neat, but nobody was on the course. And we saw what I know was the clubhouse now. It looked like a shack from MASH, and it was and that's what it was. And we walked in, and I said, "Look," I said, "I'm from New York City. I never played golf. I don't even know. I don't even know what a golf course looks like. And here's my buddy. He's a farm boy from Iowa." I said, "What do you have to do? How do you learn this game? Or what do you have to do in order to play this game?" He said, "Oh, you got so many tries. You get this white ball, and you hit it 100, 150 yards, 200 yards, whatever it is, and you get it into the little hole. You got so many times to get it in." And then he gives us what I know now. He gives us 1 iron each. And I don't know if anybody ever, I used to see as a kid or years ago, W.C. Fields, who used to shoot pool with a warped cue stick. And that's the type of club that we got. The the clubs were made out of wood, and they were warped. And and he said to me, "These look kind of warped." I said, "What the hell do I know?" I said, "Maybe they're all warped. Maybe this is the way you go." So we got the clubs, club, one each, and we got a ball, and we went out, hot like hell, and we start hitting the ball, you know, and so forth and so on. And this is like a Bob Newhart story. He said, boy, this is some heck of a game. I said, yeah, what do you mean? He said, look, you got this club here, and I'm pretty sure that it's warped. And I don't think you should be playing with a warped club. I said, what do I know? I said, maybe they're all that way, you know. And he said, look, you got to hit this little white ball into this hole, and then you got to hit it again so many yards, you know, whatever it is. He said, I got a better idea. I said, what's that? Let's go back to the clubhouse for a beer. That took all of 7 minutes that we were on the golf course, and that was my introduction to golf. I thought that was pretty funny. And everybody who knows anything about the game always laughs on that one. But these are the things that you pick up.
So this Camp Woods was a recreation place then?
It was.
And where was it in?
It was in Japan.
In Japan.
It was an army camp. That's all.
So you were sent there like as a
R&R, yeah. If we wanted to go there, we can go there, you know. And that was it. Just a place to go, to hang out. And we didn't do too much there. We were just driving around and whatever. But getting back to Don Kurth again, if it wasn't for Don Kurth, I probably would have stayed in New York City. You think about what kind of an influence somebody makes on you. Don and I wrote to each other, and then we got married. Our wives used to write. He left the service in 1951 because he joined in 47. He joined a year before I did, and the same thing occurred. He enlisted for 3, he got 4. I enlisted in 48, so instead of 51, I came out in 52. But he got out in 51. And like I said, our wives used to write, and so forth. I'm sorry, our wives were, I wasn't married in those days. We used to write now and then and so forth. But then when we got married, our wives used to write. Now, in 1983, I get a call. Now, this is 30 some odd years later. I get a call, and on the other line, the fellow says, do you know who this is? And I'm saying, I don't know who's playing games with me. And all of a sudden, I'm thinking. And then all of a sudden, it occurs. I said, yeah, I think I know who it is. I said, this is my shit-kicking farm buddy from Iowa, isn't it? He said, yeah. He said, we're in Delaware, and we come through Connecticut. And he said, what do you think? I said, you and Beverly, his wife's name was Beverly, come on down and expect to spend at least a couple of days with us before you go home. He said, good. So I made up my mind. I had an office downtown in Stratford. I put my key in the lock. But it's kind of interesting. He came up, we had some parking in the front, and he had this old Jeep with him, and he came walking through the corridor, and it's like time stood still. He didn't look like he changed at all in 30 years. But there's one thing I always remembered him and about farm guys. They all walk the same. They walk like they have a load in their pants. They walk slow. And that was it. So we got back to our house, you know, and we ate, and then I took him for a ride up to Mystic. And he said, you know, he said, this is the first time since I got out of the service that I've seen water again, because he went back to the farm. And for many years our wives wrote, and unfortunately he was a smoker. Don was a smoker. He smoked, I don't know, maybe 2-3 packs a day, whatever it was. And then I think it's about 10 years now, at least 10 now. His wife calls up and she said, Don passed away. I said, wow. He died of emphysema, and I knew why and how. So I sent my regards. I said, but I'd like to have you, whenever you're coming east, I'd like to have you stop by. If you got any of your kids, your daughter, whatever, bring them along and stop by and say hello. And they did. They came by about 5 or 6 years after he was gone. And the daughter came up. She was grown up. And it's kind of interesting because when I looked at the daughter had many features that he had. Her face looked like his face. And a real farm girl type, you know, and so forth. But he taught me a lot. He taught me a lot. Sometimes, even though the person doesn't have everything in common the way you have it, if you just learn and listen, I've learned that you can learn something from anybody, everybody. And I learned a lot from him. So when I came home, in 1952, I said, I'm going to be out of here within a couple of years. I said, I'm not going to continue with this rat race anymore. And that was 60 years ago in New York City. And like I said, you meet up with somebody who influences you for one reason or another, and that's my story about Don Kerr. Where are we?
Let's go back to some of the things that back in Korea. There were times when you had to sink ships. What were they called? Sampans.
Oh yeah.
Well, what was the reason for that? Well,
because they were carrying mines.
Oh, because of the mines.
In fact, I have a picture, which I have to dig it up. I've got pictures where we captured the sampan at sea. There were about 4 or 5. The sampan is maybe 20 feet long, you know, and maybe 6 feet wide or whatever. And it's just like ancient sailing, if you want to call it that. And they didn't even have any motors on them. They just rode some sort of paddling on them. But we picked them up at sea, and we brought them along. We didn't blow them up because they didn't have a mine, and we just felt like there's no reason, if they don't have any guns or anything, just to blow them. We could have blasted them away, but if they did have any mines, we would have blown them away. And sometimes we saw mines floating, and then we shoot at them and blow them up. But it was a terrible thing, just like I think it was the Coles that had that done and a number of years ago, where they put a mine somewhere and it blew up and a number of men got killed and so forth. But
you were patrolling the coast. Did you go all the way up to North Korea?
Oh yeah, we were. That's where we were. All the places that I mentioned, Incheon, Hungnam Harbor.
So you could fire onto the shore. Could you see from the ship enemy installations on the shore?
Only if you had these strong. You got these big binoculars that you have aboard ship, and you could see 10 miles. What we did a number of times, and other guys who were in the Marines and so forth, who were fighting at that time, we used to shoot at trains going through tunnels. It was just like Japan many years ago. They used to have trains carrying supplies going through tunnels. So we'd be shooting at them to wipe them out. But the crazy thing was, you shoot at them and you blow up the tunnel, and 3 or 4 days they're coming back again, and you see them again. So those are the things. And we used to work with helicopters, and they were used as spotters, where some of our guys were in the beachhead, and the North Koreans were not that far away, and they needed a little help. It was just like the Second World War. You know, somebody said, I remember somebody saying that the Navy didn't do anything in the Second World War. Now, if it wasn't for the Navy at Normandy, you would have had all these guys who went in, and the Germans were prepared for them. They were blowing them away like hell. And then finally they called up the Navy, and the Navy came through, and they bombed the heck out of Normandy on the other side, which allowed our men to go through and continue. And it's the same thing here. We knocked off, I think before our 2 tours of duty were over, somewhere I have these statistics, we knocked off over 5,000 rounds of the big guns, shells, over there, and so forth, over a period of two years almost. But these big guns, you know, they're powerful. And we had 40s when we get close. If we were able to get close, we'd shoot with 40s, which they don't have anymore. And then we also had 20s, which we very seldom use, and so forth. So we had the big guns, you had 40s, and then 20s. And that's what we shot with. And we, when we used sonar, sometimes the sonar would see if there's any subs around or strange things going on in the water, and sometimes there'd be fish. You'd get a big swarm of fish, and then you found out that they weren't the enemy. They were just fish. You know, after a while, you'd hear the beeps going on, the blips, and so forth and so on.
Now, you talk about this rendezvous with the USS Isabel, and you got passengers aboard your ship. Talk about that incident.
There was the Isabel, the Bass, and forget the other one. I don't quite recall.
Well, apparently there were 5 men who came on your ship, and they were ROK intelligence men?
Oh, that was another, yes. Yeah, Republic of Korea. Yeah, those were, yeah. And we saw them at sea, and we picked them up. And we wanted to make sure that they were on our side, because you can't tell the difference between these men over there. Either they were farmers and they looked alike, or whatever. So that was another incident where after we found out that everything was all right, then we let them go, and that was that. But there's so many little things that occur.
But they came aboard dressed in North Korean uniforms, so.
No, they didn't. To be honest with you, I don't recall if they were uniform or regular garb, to be honest with you. I really don't. I have pictures of them, and I haven't looked at them in a long time. But
so was there a constant threat, since you couldn't recognize north from south?
Oh yeah.
Of who's
you got to make
friendly
sure
and who's
you know.
not.
You got to make sure you know who they are. Yeah. Yeah. So, after making one trip over there, we came home after about 10 months, 12 months.
What date would that be when you came back?
That was about 8 or 9 months later, after.
Was that in June of '51, around there?
That sounds right. 51 we came back in the summertime of June, and I went home. And when I went home on leave, I told my brother was living at home, and he was in the Marines, Second World War. I told him, I'm going to go AWOL, I told him. He said, what do you mean? I said, look, I enlisted for 3 years, and I got another year to go. And nobody knows what's going on over there. I said, there's nothing on TV. I said, the only thing you read is the New York Times and maybe 6 or 7 sentences, and there are men and women getting killed over there. And nobody knows what's going on. What the heck am I doing going over there where nobody knows what's going on? And a lot of our men are getting killed. And he convinced me. He said, "No, he was a Marine sergeant, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, and I don't think he slept a night until he died. He used to pop pills all the time. He died at 71. He was a sergeant in the Marine Corps, and I always felt sorry for him, but that's neither here nor there." Yeah, but I went back and went overseas again. It's kind of interesting about Japan. The first time we were there, they were paving this road right near the town where the businesses were. And they were tampering with the blacktop on it by hand, about 4 or 5 guys. And it couldn't have been more than maybe 100 feet, 200 feet long maximum, and it wasn't that wide. Then I'd go home on leave, come back a few months later, and they're still working on it. They didn't have any type of sophisticated machinery in Japan. And when you think about it, what they did in the past 60 years, from 1950 to 2010, they've accomplished more in 60 years in Japan than the previous 500 years, with all the high-tech stuff.
Was there a lot of devastation in Japan when you were there?
In what respect?
Buildings still knocked down? And
oh, no. No. I didn't see it.
I mean, the country had rebuilt itself in that
for
a period of time?
No. I didn't. I tell you what, I didn't go. I stayed as close as I could for one reason or another. I didn't go to Tokyo because they said it's just like New York. You know, it's 5 years after the war.
Did you get to Nagasaki or Hiroshima?
No, I didn't do that. I didn't go there. An interesting thing that occurred, we'll just get off that area. There were 5 sailors and about 500 Japanese people. We went to a cherry blossom festival, the original cherry blossom festival. And I've got pictures and I got to look them up, and I had them not that long ago. We had magnums of sake. I had 2 magnums, one on each shoulder, and we were walking up this road to the picnic area. Now we never drank sake before. The guys we drank American booze that we used to buy at the enlistment men's club, but we didn't drink sake. But now we're going to drink sake. And sake, after we found out you drink in these little cups, we had water glasses, and we filled them up with water glasses. And as the sake went down, it felt good going down, because it was a fairly hot day and the sake was cool, you know. After about 2 or 3 glasses, though, after about 2 or 3 hours, 2 or 3 glasses, we all had cameras, each one of us, about 6 guys, 6 Navy guys. Slowly but surely, we hit the deck. But each guy who was still standing took pictures of the guys that were hitting the deck. So we still have those pictures. And they were playing music, you know, and I can always remember as we hit the deck, the people are looking down at us saying, gee, what are they doing there? You know, that's their thoughts. But they were dressed up in the Japanese garb, and they were dancing, and we were dancing with them, you know. We knew how to dance around, and so forth and so on. But that was a very interesting experience.
So your main form of entertainment off the ship was going to Japan? Was that where you went for? Did you ever go into Korea itself? Did you ever go and live in Korea?
No.
No. So it was just Japan for recreation, for
Correct.
R&R, as you said.
Correct.
And aboard ship, the entertainment was, you mentioned movies?
Yeah. They had movies, and And when we pulled into Japan, they had men, tailors, who came aboard, and they were selling suits. They take your measurements, and make up a suit, come back in a week or two, and you got a suit there.
And you did that?
No, I didn't, because I had plenty of suits. I had a lot of suits when I was home. I always liked clothes when I was a kid. And believe it or not, I was buying my own clothes when I was 13, 14 years old. And that was a fact. It was out of necessity, but I'm not going to get into that.
The food aboard ship, was that, talk a little bit about that.
Well, the food wasn't bad, It was acceptable, let's put it that way. And the only thing is, the old-timers, the guys who were in the Navy for 20, 30 years, when we'd have rough seas, and you had some of these kids whose stomachs couldn't take the sea, they'd make fun of them, or they'd make fun, and they'd almost want to make them sick so they can grab the food, the tray away, That was kind of crazy, but it was true.
Well, did you hit many days of rough sea? And I know typhoons hit those areas. Did you ever have problems with that?
We had rough times, but fortunately, the Atlantic is worse than the Pacific, actually, from what we found out. But when you're on a destroyer, they call it a tin can sailor, and that's what it is at sea. It's like a tin can. You can go on the boat deck, and when you're looking down in the rough seas, the waves go over the stern, and you better not be there, because you'll get washed overboard. And there were days when it was like that. And even the captain, who was a seasoned sailor, now and then, he'd even get sick. After 20, 30 days at sea, and in rough seas, it's not like these cruisers today, these ships today. They're big and they got all the buoyancy and everything. The destroyers don't have that.
Well, you finished your second tour. How much time was there between your first and second tour?
Oh, not a heck of a lot. I'd say approximately 2 to 3 months, maybe.
When you went back on the same ship?
Oh no, when I went back, let me just stop and think. Oh, yes, when I went back, it was on the same ship. When I left, I was on a transport, because my ship was there, and my 4 years were up. So
you came back on a transport ship?
Yeah, like Army guys, and guys who were coming back.
And you came back to where? To talk about coming back.
I came back to San Francisco. Not to San Diego, because San Diego was where the destroyers were.
Were you discharged at
San Francisco?
San Francisco?
Yeah.
And that you came directly home?
Oh yeah.
Flew? Train?
Yeah, oh no. Flew
home. And that was your home then, was New York?
New York City.
And everybody was expecting you, and was there a reception for you?
Oh no, no receptions.
What was the attitude of people at that time when you met them and told them that you were in the Korean War? What was the general attitude of people?
Well, it was kind of strange. It wasn't like the war after that.
Vietnam?
Vietnam. The people did not know what was going on. That's the strange part of it. They didn't know. My family knew a little about what was going on. My sister, my oldest sister, read, she was one of these people who blows things out of proportion. She read where our ship was sunk. She thought. I think it was all in her mind. Maybe she read where there were some destroyers got killed, got hit or whatever. But when I came home, it was like nothing happened. really and truly. Came back to New York City,
How did you feel about that?
Oh, I thought of, I've been thinking about it for 50 years. Now, for example, well, these guys, there were 6 of us. I went to a reunion in the year 2000, and the fellow there, I got his letter and so forth. He formatted my log. I wrote the log out of 2 little books.
And the log, explain what a log is.
A log is exactly what it is. It's the performance of a ship, where it goes, at what time, and what it did. Exactly. And on the back of the log, there's code names of ships. Now, I'll preface that by saying, my family, there were people coming around in my family while I was in the service, when I was in the Navy, aboard ship. And they were saying, there's some men who are asking questions about you. And I had to stop and think. I was cleared for secret, not top secret, for secret. I wrote the log. And I didn't show anybody the log until 50 years later. When I was playing golf down here, 8 or 9 years ago, and I ran across one of the guys, and he was a, trying to think of the word.
Was he a serviceman? Somebody
Yeah.
was in the service?
Yeah. He was in intelligence. That's right. He was in intelligence. Somebody said he was in intelligence. So I asked him. I said, I was on a destroyer, 55 years ago. At that time, I said we had code names that were written down. I said, do you happen to know? Do they still have the same code names? And he said, no. They change them every 10 years. So I said, oh, okay. Then these code names are irrelevant to today's, oh yeah. But I've been waiting a long time to put this out to the public. Many years. I still have the original. I have the original books that I wrote them in, and then I have copies of the original books. And then when I went to reunion, there were 6 guys there, of which I had pictures of them 50 years ago. And I made copies because I knew they were going to go there. I wasn't interested so much in the fellows who were aboard the same ship in 1968 or whatever it was, because there's no commonality there. I was interested in the fellows who had the same experience and I, and vice versa, and how, we managed to help each other, and we knew what the hell was going on, and fortunately we came home. Now the unfortunate thing is, and this is what's going on, this is what happens. 2 years later I went to another reunion, and then there was one fellow, unfortunately, passed away out of the 6, so there were 5. And then a couple of years later after that, a couple of more fellows passed away. So actually, the ones that I'm now in contact with, there's maybe 2 or 3 left, but there may be many more. These are the ones who went to the reunion. No, but you have to remember, these fellas, I'm going to be, knock on wood, I'm going to be 83 in October. So, as far as I'm concerned, time is running out. And that's why I have to get this thing going. So, like I said, at least my immediate family would know what took place.
Is this part of this book that you're writing?
Yeah, this is the book about Korea. And then I have a separate book, which is going to be my memoir. Yeah. In fact, I'm working with your buddy, Richard Dietrichson. He's helping me out. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about coming home, pick up on your life after the service. Well, what did you do? Where'd you
Okay.
go? And
What I did when I came home, I had a job in the city for a while. I worked for an outfit called Do All Eastern. They made the bandsaw blade, and they used to sell blades to the Bridgeport machines and so forth. I found out, through my readings and so forth, and a lot of people don't know this, that Bridgeport, Connecticut during World War II was about either the third or even more than that, third largest industrial city in the United States. And people from the South came up in order to work here. And it's a shame that's what's happened. It's really a shame what's happened because of industry, and not keeping up with it or whatever it is. But at any rate, so after I came out, I had a brother-in-law, a little older than I. He was in the Second World War, and he was working for Strauss Store agency in the Bronx. And he said, do you want to go into business? We can get a franchise, a Strauss Store franchise. And I was thinking, I said, yeah. I said, where is this going to be? He said, I know a little about Fairfield, Connecticut. He was living in the Bronx at the time. It was my sister's second husband because, unfortunately, her first husband died of a heart attack. They didn't have any children. So we put up, I had $2,530 or $3,000 at the time, and he borrowed some monies and so forth, and my brother put in a few bucks. We had to come up with $10,000. And we opened up a Strauss Store franchise right in Fairfield. I don't know if you're familiar with the Post Road in Fairfield. It was across the street from Reef Road. Now in those days, I remember like the fingers on my hand. On Reef Road on the corner was a pharmacy called, let's see, Marie, and her husband was Lou, Italian name. But at any rate, that was a pharmacy on Reef. And on the corner on the other side, where my store was, I was right next to, there was a camera store, Fairfield camera store. And a few doors away, I met a fellow whose parents took their business from Bridgeport to Fairfield, and that was the Fairfield Center Jewelers. And so
how long were you in that business?
How long was I in it?
Yeah.
3 years.
3 years. And then from there you went where?
I went, from there I did picture framing. But here's the interesting part. The interesting part is I learned an awful lot. 6 months after we opened up, he has a nervous breakdown. And he was the one who was supposed to have known the business. So I'm 25 at that time. And they moved back to New York, and I'm renting a room. It was about 1990 when I read an article in the Stratford paper, I believe it was in the Stratford paper. And a fellow by the name of Bob Mastroni, he had written that we should have a Korean monument up at Academy Hill. He mentioned the fact that, unfortunately, he lost his brother at the age of 22, who was a corporal there. And since I spent some time in Korea, I felt the same way as he did. So I called him up and I said, I'd like to help you out. I know a little about fundraising or whatever, and I would like to see a Korean monument up at Academy Hill. I said they have other monuments up there, and so forth. So we got together and we went down to the VFW, which I never went down to before, and we got a group of men together, and slowly but surely we accomplished what we wanted to. It took almost about a year, I think, to do this, because we didn't have any corporate help. We weren't asking for, we were looking for about $25,000, as I remember. That was the number. And we did all different things. I ran a journal, an ad journal and so forth, which I'm used to. And then my kids even got into a 5K run. My daughter and my son raised money that way. And Bunnell High School made these puppies that they sold for $1 each at the Stop and Shop. And we did a lot of little things. But fortunately, at the end of the year, we not only came up with 25, I think we ended up with either 33th, either with 30th, about $30,000. We had about $5,000 in excess of what our goal was. And when that got done, the only thing is, I don't know what happened that day when they had, I have copies of the presentation and everything, but I was out of town. And I don't know whether we went out, whatever it was. But I have articles that they interviewed me on, because I told them I spent some time in Korea and so forth. In the Post took some pictures of me in my office, and I still have copies of those and so forth. But and then we bought bricks. And that came out fine. That came out fine. And the only thing that disturbed me much later on in years, when this fellow Bob Mastroni said we should have a World War II monument, and there were certain, this is the problem with politics and so forth sometimes, or certain people who have I call it small minds, where the people at Academy Hill, the ones who lived around there, they said, oh, we have enough monuments here, we don't need World War II. And when you stop and think, there weren't thousands, but there were millions of people killed in World War II. And I have to really thank you for working. And you worked your butt off, I'm pretty sure you did, like you usually do, for doing that. But I believe we all have a contribution to make while we're on this earth here. And no matter what it is, you volunteer here, you volunteer there, and so forth. I've been in public service. I've spent about 25% of my life in public service. I could go way back, but I'm not going to do that, because that's not the point. The point that I'm making is that sometimes you just have to keep going, and if you present yourself correctly and if you make sense, then you could accomplish something. And that's it.
Thank you. Now, the final thoughts on this? What did this experience do for you in your life, this whole experience of what you did?
Well, I tell people this. I'm glad you brought her up. As far as I'm concerned, if a young man or young woman doesn't want to go to college, and they're, for one reason or another, they're stuck on a job, join the service. Don't join the service because of a war or anything like that. Join the service so you can meet people from other walks of life, and then you'll get a much broader education than you would anywhere else. Because like I was influenced, and everybody else is, when you come out of the service, and I've said this many times in front of different armed forces groups, you're a different person. You have to be a different person because of the experiences that you've made. It's not like going to college, because going to college is one thing, you're going there for an education. But I like to think about this. When you're in the service, and especially during the war, it's an education about life, about working together under various circumstances. And you can't buy that. You can't buy the experience that you had. And everybody changes. You have to change. That once you experience war and so forth, you have to change. And you may be one type of a person, thinking about whether it be, prejudices and so forth and so on. When you're in the service, there's no prejudices, or shouldn't be. You're all fighting for a common cause. And I've experienced that. And I didn't experience any prejudice when I was in there.
I want to thank you for a wonderful interview, and I want to thank you for serving our country.
And thank you for letting me do this.